Okay.
Well, hello, folks. You're on the Insecurity Project with Jamin. Today, I have the great privilege of interviewing Monica Bourgeau. Now, Monica, I came across Monica maybe 6 months ago. I don't know. It might not have been quite that long ago, but I'm a big spiral dynamics fan, as you probably know. And Monica has written an incredible book on the subject, much more accurately back to the source. And so reached out to me to see whether there was a point of connection around this fantastic model, and was kind enough to send me a copy of her book, which I have thoroughly enjoyed. The book is the Change Code, a practical guide to making a difference in a polarized world. So we're going to talk to Monica about this book and some really fascinating ideas that she shares about this. So Monica, thanks so much. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me here, Jamin. Really appreciate it. And I love the work you're doing around the Insecurity Project. I think it's just such great timing for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. That's really cool. Now, speaking about insecurity, I'm really interested with all my guests to hear your own journey with insecurity. And would you be willing to share a bit of your backstory from where you started, how well your parents did at helping you manage your own self-esteem, and times in your life where insecurity has actually got in the way, and the process of how you've resolved that?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Well, I grew up for the most part in a very small town in Montana. So the town that I grew up in had a bar and a store, and I used to travel 15 miles each way to my school. So it was a very different environment. And then, from there, of course, I went to college and got a degree, but I ended up in the corporate world in a very male-dominated field of healthcare and managed care and that sort of thing. And, I was really ambitious and really wanted to kind of move up the corporate ladder. At that time, I had a young daughter that I was supporting. And so there was definitely a lot of moments of insecurity that I had to overcome. And kind of a lifelong struggle for me, too, has been insecurity around public speaking and even doing podcasts. I still have to kind of pump myself up a little bit. I've probably done 15 or more now for the book, but I still have a little routine that I go through to kind of get myself in the right mindset, and breathing exercises and essential oils and all of those sorts of things, because I've been speaking for more than 20 years in my corporate career. I've had to give a lot of presentations, and sometimes in front of large groups, but there's still that whole process that you have to go through still comes up.
Yeah, sure. I love the fact that it's a never-ending process. I'm convinced that it is possible to be unhindered by doubt, fear, and insecurity at the level of growth that you're at now. But that being unhindered would cause you to step forward into new levels of uncertainty. And that will always expose new insecurities. People who are secure about speaking to 10 people might be insecure about speaking to 100 people, or people who've run a team of 3 might be comfortable with that, but insecure about running a team of 20. So I love the fact that it's a constant growth journey, and there's always work to be done around this. So this book that you've written, The Change Code, can you give the listeners an overview about the message there, and tell us about the key idea of this book and why you've written it.
Yeah, so I've always felt the need to try to make a difference in the world and to want to make the world a better place. But for a long time, I think I didn't know how to do that. And so, I was in the corporate world, as I mentioned, and climbed the corporate ladder. And then, of course, when I got to the VP position that I had been striving to get to, I thought, what is this? This is not what I want. And so I had to really take a look at myself and take a look at what I was doing. And so, I started blogging back in probably 2011, 2012, something like that, and just writing and doing this kind of discovery process. And then in 2016, I decided, I'm really going to write a book. And so, I started writing, and I feel like once you fully step into something that you're meant to do, that the universe really starts to kind of open up all of these doors for you. And I feel like that's what really happened for me. And so, once I decided to write the book, I went to church, actually, which I haven't done in a really long time. And I learned about spiral dynamics. They announced that they were doing this 6-week class on spiral dynamics, which is this, amazing change process, kind of the underlying pattern for human change. And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting, right? Not knowing what I was stepping into. And of course, after the first class, I was like, oh my gosh, this is just amazing. And of course, it has to be the framework for my book, because it completely changed how I looked at the world. It helped put a lot of context around a lot of things that were happening in the world right now. And so what went from just a really simple book about how to make the world a better place became this book around the change process. And I really dove deep into polarization, because we see so much of that in the United States right now. And I was really frustrated, because I felt like, how are we supposed to tackle some of these big challenges like climate change and immigration and now a pandemic, when we can't even talk to each other? And so I felt like I needed to really understand the causes of polarization, and using spiral dynamics and this change framework, it really helped put a lot of context around that for me. So I worked pretty diligently for more than a year and completed the book, The Change Code, at the end of last year. And it was a really amazing and just great personal growth process for me as well in writing the book.
Yeah, wonderful. And a credit to you for the work that you've done. It's a real gift to the world you've brought. Can you step us through your understanding of the levels, the spiral dynamics model itself, and give an overview of how the model works?
Sure, you bet. And I should have mentioned also that in writing the book, I actually made more than 3 trips to Beck, who, as you know, was one of the pioneers in spiral dynamics. And I kind of became obsessed with the theory and began to just read and listen to every possible thing I could about spiral dynamics. So I definitely don't think I'm an expert, but I've spent an enormous amount of hours reading and studying about spiral dynamics. So for those of your listeners who are not familiar with the theory, I know you've got some great articles, but just to give a little backstory, it was developed by a developmental psychologist whose name was Clare.W. Who started researching about what makes up a healthy human being, because he used to teach psychology classes in Schenectady, New York. And his students used to come to him and say, Dr. Graves, you're teaching us all of these great psychological models. And my undergraduate degree was in psychology, and I had never learned about spiral dynamics, which was mind-blowing to me when I did finally learn about it. But they used to come to him and say, which is the right model? And Dr. Graves said, I don't know. So he set out on a mission to uncover what creates a healthy human being. So he spent more than 10 years collecting data from more than 1,000 individuals. And what he identified was the underlying pattern for human change, which is just amazing when you look at the implications for that, and not only understanding where we are as societies, but also as individuals. And so what he uncovered were 8 layers. So essentially, these are layers of development that we all have to go through. We all have to go through them in the exact same order. And so you can't skip a stage, and you go through them, and they build on each other it kind of is like an onion. So the next layer emerges over the previous layers. And so once you reach a developmental layer, you always have access to those skills and understandings that you developed in that layer. And so Clare.W. Graves was this psychologist that I mentioned, and his work never got published, unfortunately, because he ended up getting to be quite ill. But fortunately for us, Dr. Don Beck and Christopher Cowan discovered his work, and Dr. Beck actually traveled to Schenectady, New York, and met with Clare.W. Graves a number of times and became great friends, and they worked together for many years. And they documented his model in a book called Spiral Dynamics. And so they documented these different layers. But as part of that process, Dr. Beck named the layers by color. And the reason that he says that he did this is because he was actually working with Nelson Mandela during the time that they were trying to eliminate apartheid in South Africa without a civil war. And so he felt like it would be easier to have just a simple way to refer to these different layers so that Nelson Mandela would know how to approach a group. So for instance, Dr. Beck would say, okay, Nelson Mandela, give your blue speech to this group, or give your red speech to this group, because they were dealing with a wide range of tribes across South Africa and different groups of people, and they were trying to bring them all together. And so if you'd like, I can just give a kind of a quick overview.
Yeah, please. That'd be wonderful.
Layers. So the first layer is also called beige, and beige is very survivalistic. You know, the main focus of individuals who are perceiving the world through the beige layer are, you know, food and reproduction and just having their basic needs met. Then the second layer is purple, and purple is very much about keeping the nest warm, creating these almost tribal values of connecting people. There's usually like a chief, and there's also kind of belief in, you know, mystical forces, all of the different gods that you saw in mythology, those types of things. And then the third layer is red, and red is very much based on individuals who dominate others. And so, you know, conquerors who come in and take over entire countries, or you know, people who are super strong and just want to be the toughest person. That's an example of red. And then the fourth layer is blue. And so when we started to see blue in societies, this actually came about when we began to move into an agricultural era where people started moving to farms and into communities. And so there needed to be a set of common rules and understandings that everybody operated by. And so that's the blue layer. And that's also when religion became really into play, and Christianity and those types of rigid structure systems. And one of the things about blue is that there's almost always a higher order. And so you might be working hard right now, but you are hoping for some benefits in the afterlife or something like that. So you're delaying gratification now for benefits later. So that's one of the key components for blue. And then the next layer, which is the fifth layer.
So can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
You know, so I talk about blue as as level 4, the system. So I would understand that as the delayed gratification is almost like you're working a job you don't like, and the delayed gratification is thinking about retirement as that's your reward. That's when you get to take it easy. That's when life starts for you. So would that be an example that fits your model?
Yeah, that's a great example. And that's what a lot of us believed, right? And then now most of us know that a lot of times companies will lay off individuals, and so some of those belief systems no longer hold up for some people. So then once you move from the blue layer, the next layer is the fifth layer, which is orange. And orange is very scientific, very materialistic. It's all about success and individual success and getting ahead in the world and doing the best you can. But it's one thing that I should mention is that these layers, they go up in the shape of a spiral, which is what the name came from. And they also go from a me focus, so very individualistic, to a we focused. So for instance, when you move into orange, it's a very individual focused.
Yeah, sure.
And this is the predominant layer in most of our societies at this time, is this orange layer. But we're starting to shift out of it now, which is what's causing a lot of the tension and chaos and polarization that we see. And so, so the fifth layer is orange. And then the next layer is green, which is the sixth layer, and I've got just a couple more layers to go. So green, so one thing I might mention too is that each of the layers have positive expressions and negative expressions. And so when you begin to move into a layer, it starts to solve the problems that were caused before in the previous layers. And so when you first move into a layer, it's really helpful, but then eventually it starts to go too far. So for example, with the orange, we're starting to see all this plastic in the ocean and all this pollution. So our materialism and, getting ahead has kind of gone too far to the extreme. And so essentially there's an auto correction, right? So it begins to move to the next layer, which is green. And green is very much about healing the self, healing the planet, creating equality, and starting to heal a lot of the things that we saw in the orange layer. So then from green, we go to the next two layers, and these are where it gets really exciting, because Clare.W. Graves actually wrote an article about moving to this next tier. He calls it the second tier. And he wrote an article that was in the Futurist magazine in the 1970s, which is actually how Dr. Beck learned about his work. And the title of this article was "Mankind Makes a Momentous Leap." And what Dr. Graves was saying is that when we move from this green layer into the next two, which are yellow and turquoise, which I'll talk about briefly, that it is such a momentous leap for humanity that we're able to operate at such a high level. In fact, he said that we're able to manage more complexity in the seventh and eighth layers than all of the previous layers combined. So to say that it's a momentous leap is kind of an understatement even, which is exciting. And so that talks about yellow, which is the seventh layer. And the seventh layer again moves back to being more individualistic. But with the seventh layer, we're able to really use both sides of our brains. And so we're able to understand the scientific and rational thought processes, but we're also able to be very intuitive and creative. And one of the things that Graves talks about in the seventh layer is that you're able to take the best of all theories. And so you're no longer tied to a specific belief system or dogma. You're able to take the best from everything that we know. And you're also able to understand paradox really well. And so things are no longer just black or white. It's the gray in between. And so as a result, you're able to come up with these really unique solutions and begin to solve a lot of the really challenging problems that we've seen so far. And in the book, I talk about wicked problems. And so when we have enough people in this yellow layer, we're going to really be able to cope with these wicked problems, which essentially don't have a clear solution. And then I'll just touch on the final layer, which is turquoise. And so turquoise, when an individual sees the world through a turquoise lens, they're able to really almost connect with the universe. And so you understand, the benefit and connection to the earth and the animals and all living species. It's really one of the words they use to describe it quite often is unity. You're able to really connect at a much higher level. So you are no longer so materialistic and all of those things. You're really in a different state. And one thing that I might mention that really relates well to what you're doing with the insecurity project is once you move from the green, which is the sixth layer, into that second tier that I mentioned, one of the indicators for that movement is that you are no longer operating from a place of fear. And so right now, there's a lot of fear that's driving our society. And so eventually, when we move to that next layer, that second tier, we're able to let go of a lot of that fear. And so just imagine being able to release all that fear and insecurity and operate from this higher place. That's what happens when we move as individuals or societies into that second tier of development.
Wow.
It's a lot to absorb.
It's so wonderful. There's a few things happening for me as you're sharing. Firstly, I thought Clare was a female, so there's my first learning. Clare.W. Grace was actually a male, not a female, so thank you for that. Secondly, I'd always been nervous about Clare finding out about my work because I just assumed I literally heard spiral dynamics once, the theory explained once, and it was not using colors, it was using words. And I probably heard it 8 years ago and have done almost zero further research about it. I've just taken it and used it and adapted it and benefited from it and thought about it. And I'm very relieved to know that I haven't deviated too far from the source. And I think Clare would be okay. So that's cool. The third thing that was going off for me was I was just reflecting on your book and how you talk about the fact that each of these layers has kind of opened up at different points in time. So, so it's only in the last kind of generations that we have access to some of these new levels as we grow as a people, and the collective consciousness of the planet grows, which I'd never really contemplated before. I just, that was a missing piece in the puzzle for me to go, you're right. Yeah, we are sitting at a moment in time where we have access to more growth, and indeed the big challenge of our world now is not really technological advance, it's consciousness advance. Like that's, and to feel part of focused work in increasing the collective consciousness of the planet so that we continue to seize the opportunity of moving beyond red and blue and even green into the higher levels, solving wicked problems, but doing them together. It's what a magnificent time to be alive, and what a useful framework for people to understand the need to keep going on and up. Which the final thing going off for me is like, oh wow, like the insecurity project fits here really beautifully in helping people do the inner work that would stop growth. One of my favorite quotes from your book, page 72, you say it's natural for humans to fear the next layer. It's because the new layer calls into question our core beliefs about ourselves, the world, and our place in the world. And so, so much about what happens for us to grow to the next layer is the inner work, and the questioning of our beliefs about ourselves, the questioning of tying our identity. You talk about people in the red layer, which is a layer of system and rules and structure, and very easy to tie your value and worth to what you do. I work a job, this job gives me status, I'm good at my job. Without that job, who am I? I have no idea who I am. And so if that job was ever jeopardized, my whole world goes into a tailspin because I've tied everything to that piece, and my beliefs about myself are tied to what I do. So this inner work, it turns out to be very, very important. Do you want to share any insights you've got around the importance of the inner work and some of the keys you've found to help people do that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I might mention too is just kind of the general change process. So as part of Graves's work, he also developed a model for how humans change. And so once you understand that, you start to see where you are in that development. And I think the layers as well, it's helpful to understand where you are. But essentially what Graves lined out is that, you know, we're going along and everything's fine, right? And then we start to feel uncomfortable and things just aren't working anymore, but we're not sure why, right? Because we've maybe grown or developed, or our life conditions have become more complex, which is what Graves determined helps move us to the next layer, is that the life conditions are so complex now that our coping mechanisms are no longer adequate to cope in that layer. And so you start to feel uncomfortable. And so you know, that could be in a relationship, it could be in a job, like, you know, you've been working here for 10 years and it's been fine and nothing's really changed, but you just aren't comfortable anymore, right? You feel like you need to make a change. And so our tendency as humans is not to just make the change, right? Because that's really difficult. None of us want to change. And so what we do as a result is we end up looking backwards to see, okay, when was a time when this job, I'll just use that as an example, felt okay? And so what was I doing then? Okay, well, I was taking longer lunch breaks, or I was you know, having coffee with my friends on the break, or whatever it was. And so you revert back to
Wow.
try to make the current situation better. But because your life conditions have become more complex, you know, maybe you've developed more as an individual, or things have changed in the company or in the system, because nothing stays the same. Though that doesn't work, and actually it creates more tension. And so Steve McDonald, who wrote the foreword for my book, he's an amazing futurist actually in Byron Bay, Australia. He talks about how this tension is like pulling the rubber band back on a slingshot, and the tension eventually gets so strong that you just can't deny it no matter how hard you try. And so essentially what happens is it propels change forward, and it puts you into this state of chaos, because right, you no longer like your job, but you don't know what you're going to do next. And so it creates this, all this uncertainty and insecurity, and who am I now? You know, I was so tied to my identity, the example you used of my job, and now I'm not that anymore, but I don't know who I am, and it just creates this tension. And unfortunately, for us to really change as human beings, we have to feel and experience that tension and that chaos, and go through that process, and just know that that's a normal part of our change and development. But eventually we start to come out of that, right? Because you can't just live your whole life in that chaos. And so eventually you start to discover new coping mechanisms, or you know, maybe you take some online courses, or you connect with a great coach who helps you through that. And so then you move into this phase of liberation where you discover these new coping mechanisms. And a lot of times people almost become evangelists because they're so excited. They're like, oh, I was in this horrible, chaotic place, and you know, Jamin helped me move through that. Or you know, I discovered whatever it was, Pilates, and now, you know, I want you to try Pilates too,
Yeah.
because it was so amazing. And so you become this almost evangelist for what you discovered. And then eventually it's like, okay, well, that's just part of my normal routine now. And then hopefully you reach a new level of stable, but you're at a higher octave. And so you may move to the next developmental layer that we just went through of Graves's work. But there's no guarantee, you know, that you will move through that process. You know, that's the goal of moving through that process. And so I think that's really helpful to understand as well, in understanding the stages.
It's so interesting, that point you make about when the point of pain comes, the tendency to revert back to the last time you felt good as the way of solving the problem. And
Yeah.
I've had a number of friends over the years, especially from a faith perspective, where the way they've understood faith stopped making sense, and there was pain and uncertainty, and they were so uncomfortable in that, their solution was to go back to simpler times. And so instead of wrestling with complexity, they feared complexity and grappled for simplicity, and almost turned off any questions and just went for the most certain thing they could find, which was a prior experience, and in fact, so went down levels rather than grow. So I think, I love the fact that being a human being is high stakes, and there are no guarantees. That's what makes it so wonderful. So there's no guarantee we're going to grow or we're going to continue to find higher forms of living. There's just as much opportunity to revert to dysfunction and to stay in toxicity and to have atrophy, which is the real challenge. And I love the work that you're doing, because I'm a big fan of frameworks. I just think they're so useful, because if you've got a framework, you go, oh, okay, that makes sense of the chaos. I get it now. I can see that chaos isn't to be feared. Chaos is a part of the process, and I'm not special, and others have gone before me, and this is a part of the growth cycle. And if I can see this framework, then I'm more inclined to push into it rather than resisting it.
Absolutely.
And the beautiful thing about that is that's not just good for you, that's good for the planet, because as you point out in the book, the problems of staying at a level create some significant challenges for the world. The level of, if you stay at blue, which is the success entrepreneur, the amount of the way we go through resources in that stage, the internal selfish focus of materialism at all costs, that comes with some serious side effects to the planet. So if you stay there, that's a problem. So the framework to say, keep going, don't stop there, keep growing, keep growing, keep growing, super useful. So thanks again for the great work that you're doing in this space.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, well, when I learned about this model, one of the reasons I was so excited about it is because it provides the context for what's happening now, but it also really gave me a lot of optimism for the future, which I, at the time, was feeling really discouraged. I'm in the United States, and we've had just a lot of change the last several years, and in fact kind of regressing almost, trying to go back to make America great again. So we've been regressing backwards in a lot of ways, and so that's been really challenging, and I was feeling really discouraged. And so to learn about this framework and understand how everything fits in, and then also to understand that we have this enormous potential, and you can map it out. And so you can map it out for a society, but also as an individual. I talk a little bit about it in the book, about my own process through the colors. And so when you look back at your own life, you're like, oh yeah, that's when I was kind of moving through, green or purple or whatever color it was. And so it really helps put your own life into perspective as well.
Yeah, incredible. So where can people find out more about your work? Where do you hang out online?
So the website for the book is thechangecode.net. I also have a personal and consulting website, which is monicabourgeau.com. And so people can reach me at either of those sites. I'm also Monica Bourgeau on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of the social media channels as well. So.
Apologies, I pronounce your name Bourgeau.
That's okay. I get that a lot.
Rookie.
No worries.
Rookie mistake. Thank you again for such a wonderful conversation. We could talk about this for days, I'm sure. I think that's been such a wonderful overview for people, and thanks again for the great work that you're doing in this space. And I highly recommend your book as a wonderful resource for people to get a hold of this framework and apply it to their own growth journey. So thank you once again.
Thank you. And thank you for all that you're doing. I appreciate being on the show.